In 1785, Immanuel Kant published a framework for ethics driven by the cold internal consistency of logic. 5 centuries earlier, Jalal al-Din Rumi composed the Mathnawi, an epic poem that found its moral center in the heat of transcendent divine love. Enlightenment logic builds a universe of rigid precision, constantly pushing against the fluid nebula of Islamic mysticism. The common academic assumption is that these worlds are irreconcilable, that reason produces absolute rules, while mysticism results in subjective, emotion-based ethics. However, examining the mechanics of their thought reveals that both thinkers reject the idea that morality is a matter of personal expedience or temporary gain. Despite their vastly different starting points, both arrived at an identical definition of an absolute moral law. In both systems, for an action to be considered good, it must be universally valid. It cannot be an exception carved out for a single person or a single moment. Furthermore, both systems prioritize the internal intention of the person acting over any visible external result. The alignment begins with the construction of a law that functions independently of human desire. Analyzing this convergence shows that absolute ethics is not the exclusive property of either logic or spirituality. Kant's ethics begins with the search for a command that applies to every rational being unconditionally. This categorical imperative is powered by pure practical reason. Human desires and physical rewards are strictly banned from its process. Its first formula is the universal law: act as you want everyone to act. The second requires treating humanity as an end, never a tool. This moral mechanism operates through internal duty alone, requiring no external fuel or reward to validate its logic. Kant's framework is a primary example of deontology. In this view, the goodness of an act depends entirely on whether it conforms to duty, regardless of what the results look like in the physical world. This relies on autonomy, the capacity for reason to legislate itself without bowing to physical impulses or external revelation. Kant's morality is a triumph of human architecture, a system built to remain upright even when human weakness pulls against it. Rumi has no direct word-for-word equivalent to the categorical imperative, but his Mathnawi outlines a similar structural rejection of self-interest. He defines the problem through aql-e-jozi, the partial intellect. This calculating mind looks only for personal utility and worldly desires. It is too fragmented for a moral foundation. He contrasts this with aql-e-kol, the universal intellect. In his writing, this higher intellect seeks what he calls niki-e-kol, or the universal good. This universal intellect functions as a parallel to Kant's universal law. It seeks a truth that is valid for the whole of creation, not just the individual. This is most clear in Rumi's definition of justice in the 5th book of the Mathnawi. He describes justice as a lamp that is binding in every circumstance. It is an absolute light that allows for no moral exceptions. Rumi uses the language of the soul to build a defense against utilitarianism that mirrors the uncompromising nature of Kant's logic. If morality is stripped of self-interest, both systems must address the problem of hypocrisy, doing the right thing while harboring a hidden, selfish motive. Rumi addresses this in the story of Moses and the shepherd. Moses rebukes a shepherd for speaking to God in crude, human terms, believing the shepherd's form of worship is incorrect. But God intervenes, telling Moses that the divine gaze does not look at the external form of an act, but at the internal reality. Rumi distinguishes between kal, the external form, and hal, the internal spiritual state. By dismissing the rigid mask of external appearances, the moral focus shifts entirely to the truth of the internal state. Kant handles this exact vulnerability with equal severity. He introduces Gesinnung, the internal disposition of the will. An action performed simply to avoid punishment has no moral worth. Rumi's hal and Kant's Gesinnung occupy the same functional space, isolating moral value within the actor's mind. On the level of individual action, both thinkers prioritize the internal state as the primary site of moral worth. While the mechanics are synchronized, the power sources for these two moral engines lead to two opposing realities. In Kant's map, truth originates within human reason. It is a self-sustaining loop. To Kant, God is a postulate, a theoretical necessity to make the world coherent, but God is not the author of the moral law. Reason legislates itself. Rumi'S map is a vertical hierarchy. Truth originates in the divine will and pours downward into the material world. This is an absolute flow, where supreme truth originates above and cascades through reality. For Rumi, human reason is not the legislator. It is a vessel that must submit to the supreme source of love. This reveals a structural paradox. The demand for an absolute duty remains consistent, even though one system is built on total autonomy and the other on total submission. These frameworks show that absolute ethics do not require a single metaphysical origin. Whether the demand is articulated through the architecture of reason or the language of mysticism, the expectation of an unconditional moral commitment remains at the center.